Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. This is the Write the Docs podcast episode. Wow, what number are we up to now? It's episode number
20, I think.
Oh, gee, I think so. We're in the 20s. We're actually past our teenage years. How about that? Huh. There you go. That's really good. So, welcome everybody to this episode of Write the Docs podcast. We've been a little bit of a gap between episodes over the last couple of months due to, well, life being life. And we're back in action for this episode today. So thanks for joining us and thanks for listening. My name is Jared Morgan. I am a podcaster, and not just here, but other places as well, a technical writer and a massive pinball fan. And joining me today are the usual suspects, starting first on the Central Coast today, Tom Johnson. You're in Utah today, mate.
Hello, yes, thank you. Joining from my my wife's family's home in Utah, so it's kind of exciting to be out and about in another state.
Yeah. Was it a long drive? I would presume it was a drive or a flight.
Well, my wife and kids drove over and they went to Girl Scout camp, and then I flew over later and I'm driving them back. So it's about a 14-hour drive.
Oh, yeah, that's a little bit less than a Sydney drive from Brisbane, I think. Yeah, that's a long commute. That's all right. Nice scenery, I'd imagine, on the way there and back. So that's really quite nice.
Oh yeah, Nevada is beautiful if you're into like desolation and barrenness
and straight roads. All right. Well, look, joining us from the usual location tonight is Chris Ward. Hello, Chris.
Hey, how you doing?
Oh, pretty good. Pretty good. How's life over there in Berlin?
It's good. I've been on holiday for 2 weeks, so catching up with a few things, writing some fiction, writing some games, kind of
nice.
catching up with some stuff.
Yeah. Very, very good. Just chilling out.
Yeah, pretty much.
Awesome. That's the way you need to be on holidays for sure. Well, look, I think it's probably time that we actually welcome our special guest today to Write the Docs podcast. I'd like to welcome today someone who is actually in Australia. We actually have a guest from Australia today, and his name is Giles Gaskell. Hi there, Giles. How are you going?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Oh, I'm really good. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
Now, Giles, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself before we launch into the topic today? Tell us a little bit about where you work and sort of what your journey into technical writing has been.
Okay, yeah. Well, I currently work at a company called Squiz, and they own they actually develop mainly a content management system called Squiz Matrix or Matrix. So it's quite a complex beast of a tool, and they also own a subsidiary company called Funnelback, which is kind of like a search engine with machine learning capabilities and so forth. So the two kind of work hand in hand quite well together. And they actually have very sort of disparate documentation sets. So I work there as a senior technical writer, and it's kind of my job to come in and sort of implement kind of the new documentation strategy going forward within the company and sort of bring all of their help together. So, pardon me, sorry about that.
Awesome.
Yeah. And in terms of background, I've worked at other companies before. So I worked at Atlassian for a bit. That's probably where my interest in tech writing and skill sort of kind of improved a fair bit, I guess. And then I moved more into sort of developer documentation. And after that, I worked for a company in a smaller company called Covata. And then after that, bigger company called CloudBees. They do most of the development behind Jenkins. So that's where my interest in continuous integration and continuous delivery sort of came into play, and where I sort of learned more about the way documentation delivery can be continuously integrated or built, should I say.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's a fairly wide range of very interesting experience you got there, Giles. So yeah, that's very good. Now, we were going to be joined by someone else today, but unfortunately, it was going to be a twofer today. But unfortunately, the other person couldn't make it today. That's Ben. We might just sort of give a bit of background on Ben, because he's provided some of the notes that we're going to be running off today. So yeah, just if you wouldn't mind introducing Ben, so we know who this beautiful Ben is.
So I have a very good colleague in Squiz called Ben Freak, and yeah, unfortunately he can't join us today because we're doing this on a weekend, and he's usually much more of an early riser than I am. So, but he's actually working with me very closely. We've been developing a new documentation system within Squiz, which we'll be talking about, Antora, and he's helped a lot with the implementation of the continuous integration aspects of that, which have been really useful.
Sort of the that you're in the engineering end of the business. It's always good to have the contact there, right? When you're trying to get things set up.
Yeah. He's been amazing. You know, I don't think I could have done this without. You know, he's done an amazing amount of groundwork. So,
as interesting background, I used to work with Ben when I was at Ladbrokes, and I was the one spruiking Asciidoc when Ben and I were trying to work our way around documentation there, and it sort of rubbed off on him, I think. So it's good to see, you know, making documentarians out of engineering folk as you sort of go through your career as a technical writer. So it's very good to hear that that's the way you went down.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think we should get stuck in. You were mentioning that it sounds like you've got a lot of products that are sort of separated from each other, yet all of them require documentation sets. So I guess, how did you go about the whole idea of redefining the docs sort of vision at Squiz?
I think I think they already knew like the position. I'm probably like the first full-time tech writer at Squiz. I think the company been around for many years, and they've had so they wanted someone to more or less come in and then look at their existing documentation and then improve it and create more of a unified experience with the whole system. So, so pardon me. Sorry, it's a little bit cold here at the moment. The air's a bit dry. So, excuse me for that. But they wanted so they have their own matrix has documentation that is actually served in their own product matrix. But it's probably not the best tool to use for documentation. I think it can actually be, or so should I say, product documentation. It's not, the content there is not actually versioned properly. There is a versioning system that's implemented in it, but it's not like a kind of a version that has a complete self-contained set of documentation in it, which you can then flip to another version, like many other doc sites have. Or even generated from static site systems. Then there's Funnelback, and they have their own kind of they kind of operate as a separate entity to Squiz in a way. So there's obviously very different branding on their documentation site, and they actually use their own kind of bespoke static site system to generate their documentation. So it is versioned, but it's got sort of, I guess there are some limitations to it. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to find a system that was able to source, I guess, documentation from multiple different sources and then provide them in one kind of complete static site, I guess, experience, but also have the flexibility to also provide that differential branding. So we have Squiz branded documentation as well as Funnelback branded documentation. But
so
being able to
keeping the brand presence, but just making the production about the same.
And also there is like a possibility that we might want to surface some documentation from Funnelback into Squiz's product documentation, for example. We don't really know if that sort of if that level, you know, to what extent that level of surfacing will happen, but as long as it's kind of an option and a capability, then that's great. And Antora actually would provide us with these kind of capabilities as well.
Yeah, so, right.
I should also explain Antora. So Jared mentioned Asciidoc and Antora. Antora actually is a system which basically uses Asciidoc as its syntax, as its markup syntax. Yeah.
maybe we should go back a step.
Sure.
What is Asciidoc?
Yeah.
And why should I use it?
Well, Asciidoc, I mean, if anyone's kind of familiar with Markdown, it's kind of a very well-known sort of unstandardized standard for writing documentation content. So it's a little bit like wiki markup. If you ever worked with wikis before, you can write your source content in a way that is almost like pretty much human readable. And that's the aim of what Markdown is designed to do. But Markdown has a lot of limitations in it that Asciidoc as a syntax sort of overcomes and provides you with additional capabilities. So, for example, if you're formatting tables and you want to get fine tuning of where you place your content within cells and what sort of content you can place in cells, there's very limited capability of what you can do with Markdown syntax, and you would have to pretty much incorporate HTML, which Markdown does. And so you end up with, source documents that become unreadable when you come to tables, for example. Whereas with Asciidoc, it actually has a very sophisticated way of marking up table content. So you can actually align your content, for example, within table cells just using its own markup syntax. And it's just very easy to read. And it does give you a hell of a lot of flexibility. You can even include images or possibly even other pages, I guess, within a table cell. So it's amazing what you can do. Also, what it does is also it supports things like conditionally handled content. So you can sort of put, and variables as well, and they call them attributes in Asciidoc. So, for example, you can define an attribute somewhere, like a bit like a variable, and then what you can do is replace that variable or place it in your documentation throughout. It could be something like a product name, for example. And then if your company decides to go and change the name of the product, then there's only one place you have to change it. And then you can and that will sort of populate all the way throughout your documentation. So it has a lot of, and you can also, put blocks of text which you put, conditionals around. So if a particular variable condition is true, then show this content, otherwise omit it. So it has a lot of power that just doesn't exist in Markdown. Sorry. And I think when you speak to developers, I know a lot of developers are quite resistant sometimes to switching to Asciidoc. But I think in my experience, when a lot of them do, they sort of don't really want to go back to Markdown again. So, pardon me, sorry. Yeah. So I don't know. Does that answer your? Are there any more questions you had with regards to that?
I get. Well, I don't know if this goes off a tangent too much. I suppose I have experimented with it in the past, but the one thing I always found lacking for me, and I do note you mentioned this as a comment. Maybe it's changed, or maybe you just found other alternatives. I found that a lot of the text editors I like to use don't tend to support it. Well, they don't tend to support anything apart from Markdown very well, to be honest with you.
Yeah, actually, it's a good point. I think even like, for example, with GitLab, we store our content we use GitLab quite a bit, and GitLab's support for README files, for example, it has very poor support for Asciidoc, whereas it does for Markdown. So you can create table of contents or insert these kind of table of contents macros, I guess, in your Asciidoc document, and it gets completely ignored by GitLab.
Yeah, and I'm guessing it's because of things like variables and conditionals, which it's a little bit more of a challenge to just have a simple renderer.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with variables is typically you might define them in a separate file.
Yeah.
And I don't think GitLab has any kind of concept of identifying where those other files are.
The interesting thing is, though, with GitLab, I've been following Asciidoc, the Asciidoctor Twitter account, and they've actually got Asciidoc as a first-class citizen in GitLab now. So they've implemented Asciidoctor-backed Asciidoc. So it might just be that if you're running an on-premises server, you might need to upgrade to the latest version or something like that. So they've actually done the full Monty on it now, so it's fully supported.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, because I know GitHub has had GitHub has had Asciidoc support for quite a while. So
Okay.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, one of the other things is that there are not many static site generation systems also available for Asciidoc as they are for Markdown. So that's one of the other things that's a bit of a downer, I guess, from that perspective.
I need more excuses to experiment with it. It's basically just been me writing blog posts or something because I wanted to try it. I have no client or project that needs it, which is when you really need to.
Well, that's the best excuse, isn't it? When you have someone who has a need, and then you can actually dive into it on the company dime. So it's the best. So on the subject of tooling, I know that VS Code has Asciidoctor, like produced by Asciidoctor Foundation, which is open device. There's folks that have actually got Asciidoctor live preview in VS Code. Visual Studio Code, VS Code, Microsoft's. There's also very good tooling support in Atom as well. They've got like a whole package of Asciidoctor tools that you can install, including live preview, syntax hinting, and a whole lot of other cool stuff that you can put in. There's also, if you want to write purely in a dedicated IDE, there's also Asciidoc FX, which is essentially a documentation specific IDE. And it's very, very complete and offers a pretty amazing authoring environment if you're just writing Asciidoc all the time. So from that perspective, the developers who are using Atom or VS Code seems to be growing in popularity over the IDEs. They've got a pathway in there to actually start using Asciidoc in a way that allows them to see what they're writing in real time. Yeah,
I mean, I'm using VS Code as well with a lot of Asciidoctor plugins, and I'm finding it really quite useful. I should also just clarify that Asciidoc is the syntax, and the guy Dan Allen, who took up the project of revamping that, created this I guess tool set to sort of process Asciidoc syntax called Asciidoctor. So you might hear those two terms being mentioned, but there is a sort of a distinction. It's the syntax that's Asciidoc, and the tooling that generates the output called Asciidoctor.
Hey, I'm a little curious to hear more about the ability to build from multiple repositories. That seems like a unique feature that's not very common in static site generators. Usually you're limited to the content in the same repository as the rest of your tooling and so forth. But with Antora, you can build from multiple repos. How does that work? And is it really as exciting as it sounds? And like, where does the theme reside? Is there like a master and then sub repos?
Yeah, so Antora actually incorporates Asciidoctor, the Asciidoctor tool chain in as part of its build process. But yeah, that functionality is actually provided by Antora itself. And Antora is actually also developed by the same guy, Dan Allen, who created Asciidoctor as well. So I think, having the one person looking after all those kind of helps from that perspective. But the way Antora works more or less and handles that is you're on the assumption that all of your documentation if you have a documentation set, that can be analogous to all product documentation for a given product, for example. And then all of your different guides in there would be what you call components or documentation components, or modules as they refer to them in Antora speak. So for example, a documentation set, you would probably co-locate that with a Git repository with your source code, and that's where you get this kind of docs as code concept, so that and this in some ways is kind of designed to sort of encourage developers as they're working on product features to kind of write the documentation in, say, a documentation repository within their source repository, documentation folder within the source repository, and it makes it easy. They can manage the content with versions as well. So Antora, sorry, I'm explaining all this background because it will actually eventually make sense. But the Antora versions supports versions documentation by Git branches or Git tags. I know a lot of developer processes kind of prefer using tags on, say, a master branch or something like that to mark their different versions. But with Antora, we tend to prefer, I guess, branches, because what branches allow you to do is keep a long-lived branch for a particular version. And if you find an error in something, a version released several, versions ago, you can go back and correct it and then cherry pick that change back up through all the other branches. So that's kind of a nice feature to have. You could even, what I tend to do at the moment, because I'm developing a lot of docs up front with a master branch, I'm just committing directly to the master branch, which is probably not what many developers would do. But what I'm tending to do is, if I've got other version branches there and I want to just apply them, I'll just sort of work with the master branch, and then I'll just, before committing them, I'll stash them and then just apply them to all the branches that I require them to be in. And that seems to be, it's a bit of a, I guess, a hassle from that perspective, but that seems to be quite a reasonable way of working at the moment.
Just so I can understand this, Antora I have also looked at in the past, mostly a little while ago, actually, for one of your previous employers, Cloud. Well, this was for CodeShip, who they now own.
Right, yes.
I did a blog post around something around this, about trying to document microservices, i.e. modern applications that are built from multiple different applications that form the kind of one larger application, and all come with their own documentation and parameters and things like that. I think Antora was quite new then. But just to understand, is this, so what does the end result look like? Is this basically for projects that are multiple tools, or kind of multiple SDKs, or everything, all of the above, and it all just kind of renders in one place looking the same? Is that kind of what the end result looks like?
More or less, yes. Sorry, I'll eventually get to that bit there. So, assuming
we were discussing the plan.
No. So I'm answering your question in a very roundabout manner. So just assuming that you've got all of your separate documentation repositories, what Antora allows you to do is you basically have a separate repository just for the building side of things, and that's the Antora build repository that we call, because you don't want to necessarily version that. You might just have a single master branch, for example. I could get that into a little bit more complexity of why you might want to branch that repository itself, but we'll leave that a bit later. But typically what you do is, in that repository, Antora, you define these things called playbook files. And the playbook files allow you to define what repositories, for example, Git repositories or GitLab repositories, you want to build a documentation site from, as well as all the branches you want to build from that. So, and you can even use, it's kind of like a blob wildcard syntax that you use to specify the branches that you want to build from. And these playbook files are in the form of a YAML syntax file. So, like GitLab CI, its CI scripting is syntax is in YAML as well. So it seems to be quite a common, I guess, configuration file format. So you define all of those things in there, and then what Antora does is it actually runs as it's building things. It actually pulls in all of your source content from the repositories that you've defined, and then starts building all the versions from that. And then you kind of end up, the net result is a nice site where you typically define your starting point. So it could be like a particular version of a particular documentation set.
Oh, yeah.
And then when you view that, you can then click down in its default theme, you can click down in the bottom left, and then up pops a menu with all the other documentation sets and all the versions that you can select from. So it's quite, and you also, when you're in a particular documentation set, you get a little version selector at the top right.
Okay.
And what that allows you to do is to choose a different version when you're viewing a particular page, and it flips to that version of the same page. So obviously, if you're clicking a version in the left column, you'll actually go to the root page of that documentation set for a different version of the same documentation set. Yeah. Whereas you can sort of flick versions of the same page using the selector on the right.
Yeah.
But then this is all under the assumption that you're using the default theme. The thing I like about Antora is the theming side of things is kept completely separate from the information architecture output with the HTML. So you end up with the same HTML output, but the theming and the skin can be sort of configured in a separate bundle, and then Antora pulls that in and renders the output altogether. So you can actually customize your theme to your heart's content, but my experience with doing that is a little bit limited. So, yeah.
Hey, I want to ask another question. This is from something. Sorry to go into. Unless somebody wanted to follow up on that same topic. No. Okay. So, in the notes, Ben had written, updating documentation becomes part of the definition of done, which means it can't be skipped. And this, I take it, is part of your strategy for revamping the docs to make it so that documentation is more likely to not be skipped. Has implementing docs as code followed through on that premise of not allowing docs to be skipped?
Well, we're still kind of partway through. I've only been with Squiz for about a few months now, so we're still in the process of actually implementing all of these new features. We're actually experimenting with other tools beforehand, and Torah has really only sort of taken off in the last month and a bit, or a couple of months. So we're still implementing or migrating the process of migrating the content across, but into Antora from the old system. The documentation was built in, but I'm hoping and anticipating that will become part of a definition of done. So I think we will, at that particular point, we'll start implementing procedures to ensure that documentation is actually considered part of the definition of done. Yeah. Yeah, so I can't really sort of give you much insight into that just at the moment.
No, I mean, I'm fascinated by this topic because I think that if I can figure out the right mechanism that would require docs to be included as part of the definition of done, I mean, I think that would be tremendous. And definitely, like, putting the docs in the same space as developers, if they're expected to contribute or review, could be a step towards that direction. But overall, I'm not really convinced that docs as code is going to get us closer than any other system in terms of making docs a requirement. I think it's more of a culture and a process. And I don't know.
I think you definitely have to sort of implement a process. Like, if you're using an issue tracker, we use Jira. And for example, at Squiz, and if you make, for example, documentation part of a column, for example, in a Kanban workflow or something like that as a requirement, it could be an optional requirement, for example, but it just has to sort of be assessed and bringing developer teams on board with accepting that they need to actually write something with respect to a feature they're implementing, then that's a step closer to getting documentation as part of a definition of done, I guess. Yeah. But I mean,
it does tend to be more of a cultural change than a technical thing.
I think so, because
we've probably all been on many teams where we get to a certain point where the product manager or whatever says, we need to make sure nothing ships without documentation, and then it slips, and then something,
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. You can crack the whip. But I mean, it's an interesting question because, for example, with one of the products we're in the process of co-locating the documentation with it, but there are other products we've got where they have so many different repositories that go to build the actual final product that there's no one single repository that seems to be like the master repository for the whole product. So what we're finding is for those particular things, we're sort of, I guess, building up the documentation in a separate repository. I think sometimes they tag all of those repositories together, but then we can still manage the branches or the documentation branches quite separately from the tagging side of things. So yeah, so it's, you know, you're never going to always end up in a situation, I think, where you can co-locate the documentation with the source code, but you can make it a lot easier.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, particularly if, you know, developers are going to be very familiar with Git and work with it, so, you know, they'll be familiar with the workflows and the processes.
Hey, Giles, one of the notes I've seen in the doc here that we're working off is about the concept of using templates to help developers do writing and sort of get them started.
Yeah.
How have you found that, if you've actually made some inroads into using templates, and B, how that sort of fits into the whole Docs as code writing and maybe even flowing into the whole process of building docs with Antora?
Sure. I mean, well, actually, at Squiz, I can tell I've probably had more experience with that in one of my previous jobs, and it's something that I had quite a lot of success with, and it's something that I wanted to sort of, or a reasonable amount of success, and then something else kind of want to implement going forward because it seems to work quite well. I'll start off with Squiz first, and that one of the initial jobs is to look at all of their existing documentation and come up with a completely new strategy on how to basically provide an outline for the entire documentation sets for the different products. So we've got Matrix and Funnelback and so forth. So, and we're trying to organize the content by persona for different types of roles that people would you know, approach the documentation with, because it's not very clear in the existing documentation. That's not made very clear in the existing docs, but also make the documentation more use case centric. So, you know, people want to do a particular type of job or a task, organize the documentation for a particular persona, which will effectively become like a module of the documentation set. Organize that content more sort of that way. So that's kind of like a higher level way of organizing the documentation. But taking a step, you know, further into that, when in my previous job, we had some of a structure there. We had really disorganized content, and I was trying to manage to get some restructuring into that. And what I'd found was that if you provide like a baseline procedure, for example, you might actually, as a technical writer, for example, you might not have time to go through and test everything together. And that's where, you know, you can bring developers in and getting, I guess, developers involved in helping out that way. But if you provide kind of like a framework of steps that you need to follow, and not test out all the options, for example, but just so, you have like a file of, for example, there might be a step where you've got to configure a file of, a YAML file with all these different options. And all you might do is just say, this is, you know, configure the following fields as necessary, and then provide them with a list of fields, and at least provide that sort of base level of information in the source content. And then if you were to give that to a developer, they'd say, right, I've got something, I can understand this, I can actually follow it through. Because developers tend to focus more on the code that they're doing. They're not necessarily focused on or have much awareness, I guess, of how documentation should be structured. So I guess what I'm tending to find is that if you do provide that sort of framework, developers are much more willing to sort of contribute content, and they'll sometimes even do it without you even knowing. So I mean, this kind of happened a little bit in the previous company because it was fully distributed. So often, and I was probably the only member of my team in my time zone. All of my other team members were in America. So often what would happen is I'd go to sleep and then wake up the next morning and then find that work had been done. So,
well, that's a nice way to wake up.
Yeah. So I just tend to. So I kind of knew that that sort of templating that I was providing was kind of helping the developers, but you know, sort of having to do that level of work, I think, takes up quite a bit of time. So ideally, where I want to sort of take things is to provide sort of, I've got things like, for example, a style guide, a documentation style guide, for example, on how to use language and one of the things that I start wanting I'm wanting to sort of fill out in there is how to write specific types of procedures as well. So, and one of the things that, I think that would sort of make it easy is if we can get developers to just go to that stuff and make it easy for them to find that content where they can just copy and paste the source into their relevant content, and then all the content that they need to contribute to, and then just write something up based on that. So, for example, if you might have a procedure that says you need to be a particular type of user role in order, just ensure that you're that type of user first. Those are the sorts of things I find in developer written documentation that tend to be just completely omitted. So things like that. So you just tend to put in things that, make it very easy for people to follow and just, and copy and paste. And that I guess that's how they can start off, contributing really good content. Yeah.
Hey, going off on the same vein of helping developers write by providing templates, I'm kind of curious if you guys find that there's an increasing trend towards having developers write. I mean, you're a tech writer at this company. Don't people look at you and say, you need documentation? That's Giles's job. So as a developer, that's not my job. How have you shifted things to distribute the work? And Jared, I'm curious to hear from you too, because I think you've been in this situation where you create templates for others. I find myself in a current position where the number of tech writers seems to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but the work is just as much or more. And I'm not sure if this is the new direction where we have to suddenly start making templates and becoming writing coaches, or if I just need to take a different strategy.
Look, I'll launch off with this. So at the moment, I'm sort of making in Asciidoc I guess a repository template. So whenever we create a new project that requires a Git repo, we use this repository template. And in that repository template, it also has a docs folder. Within that docs folder, it has a list of template files with a lot of the Asciidoc specific build instructions put into them already, so developers don't need to think about that. But also it links off to essentially a little mini writing guide within each template that goes back to another README at the same level as the templates, which explains how to write for each type of doc type. So, the classic 4 types methodology, the tutorials, how-tos, like concept / topics and reference.
Beyond the how, how do you tell them, look, you need to be writing the docs, not me?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So it comes down to having it as part of going back to that definition of done. It does come down to having the product manager or the project manager look at that as part of the definition of done and say, look, where are the docs, even developer docs in particular, that are necessary to then write the client-facing docs, because you need at least something. You need the facts first. So I guess the way I'm approaching it now is starting off getting that sort of layer in place. And you've got to have support from everybody to do it. And that's the challenge, I think, Tom. It's getting that support. It's easier in organizations like where I'm working, where we've got about 40 people. But when you look at some organizations probably at the size that you're working in, that starts to become championing that change all the way up the chain. That's a hard ask, really, because it takes a lot of herding of cats to get to that level. What do you reckon about that, Giles? Have you Squiz is sort of a medium-sized enterprise? Have you sort of found that type of thing going on in there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a sort of situation now where I'm starting to be asked, a lot of questions about, can I document this or that and the other, and I think we are, we may have to expand our team at some point, but yeah, I think basically I'm sort of in a situation at the moment now where I'm starting to sort of implement, Antora for get people who are kind of interested, very, very interested in the technology. And I think I actually, to be honest, I haven't really gone far enough down the process, I think, to actually work out whether they're going to be on board with the definition of done, documentation and as a definition of done, which I think it's really just a cultural change, but I think they are amenable to it, because there is kind of like a cultural understanding that I can't do everything, and neither can all the other tech writers that would be there. So we kind of need to get as much kind of help on board as possible.
But when you're the only technical writer at your company, how do other people who aren't that familiar with tech writing as a role understand how much Giles can write? Like, how do they, for example, QA? I honestly don't know like how many QA people we would need to test a product. Just be like, I would just think, oh, we've got a QA person. He or she could test the whole product, when in reality, there may be a need for like 5 QA people. So the same thing could happen with tech writers. It's like, oh, we've got a tech writer. He or she can produce all the documentation we need. They're not going to understand that, no, like the tech writer can only produce so much before he or she drops dead, right? And it becomes apparent when you have like multiple writers and people can see, oh, this is about how much output and how much work. But when you're the only one, you're kind of screwed because there's no comparison point.
It is. I think it comes to a point where you just have to try and when the company starts developing kind of more momentum with releases and so forth, because that's also something that's kind of happening at the moment, then you'll start to get a feeling for, I guess, how much work is kind of required with each release. And then I think it probably gets to a point where you just have to kind of say, look, I can't, I'm struggling to actually get all of the work done for all of these products and releases. We need to bring more people on board. So it's pretty much, I guess, asking, management for more resources.
Chris, I imagine you come up against this a lot as a freelancer. People bring you in and they expect you to like wrap up everything, and you have to like teach them what your limits and boundaries are.
Yeah, I mostly try to encourage. I'm kind of doing maybe the opposite. I'm trying to encourage developers to do more and act more as a reviewer or editor of a lot of their contributions instead. The main thing is, there is never going to be enough resources to cover it all without doing it that way. So I don't use templates, but I'll use style guides and just drilling in best practices over and over again in comments and things like that.
Actually, it's interesting you say that because we're in a situation where we're having to effectively almost like rewrite everything from scratch. So, I have a feeling from that perspective, I would be involved a lot with rewriting things, some of the content completely from scratch, and then getting other people to review that content. But I think going forward, that's when you start to get with new releases and so forth. That's probably when you might start bringing other people like developers in to contribute to the content. Because I think my belief is once you have a really good structure of your documentation in place, it becomes much easier to contribute to. Yeah. It's really difficult to contribute to something that's a bit of a disorganized mess sometimes.
I also work predominantly in open source projects, so we get we try to encourage a lot of external contributions, because that's also the best way we can manage it, and removing the barriers, again, automating or manually offering advice on contributions. Especially we've had a lot of translations come in recently, but I can't even offer advice on translations. So you just have to hope that the contribution is any good, because I've got no idea. So there's a lot of just, from my perspective, removing the barriers as much as possible to
Hey, I just wanted to interject and just say thanks for Tom for joining us today. He's having to jump off.
Sorry, guys. Okay. I was going to drop off silently, but anyway.
No. Thanks again for coming today, Tom. It's been great to have you as usual. We'll see you later.
Nice to meet you, Tom.
All right. I would be actually interested to... I think you touched on it a little bit. I'd be interested to know like why you ended up, apart from Jared being the Asciidoctor Antora evangelist, what was the kind of reasons you decided on this in the first place? fundamentally. And what have been some of the, we spoke a lot of the positives, what have been some of the challenges that you've had using a tool chain that is popular in tech writing circles, but is not so well known in the kind of broader tech space? So what have been some of the problems with that as well?
Well, I think the things that have really interested me in Antora. I'll start off saying that first, but it has been some of the things we touched on before, such as very convenient version control managed through the power of Git. Being able to the colocating code, documentation with code, and being able to generate a documentation insight from multiple sources. Even being able to link between different documentation sets without having to use hard-coded links that can basically be relative. So that means that gives you great flexibility and sort of management going forward. And also that select. So one of the other things that's quite useful is that we're able to generate, and this is something that I think is really good, that other tools, because of the capabilities of Antora and the way it's designed, we can be in a position where we can generate two separate sites through C continuous integration, one that we want to expose for publicly for customers, and then the one that we want to show internally
with different variables. Actually, that's a very good point. That's something I have to embark on at the moment, and that's actually an interesting idea. Yeah.
So what we can do is we can have a build process for the internal docs that shows you the unreleased content. And build that up that way, and that's where developers can start being involved, and they can just go straight through to our internal link and see the documentation generated there, whereas the public will never see that until the product is actually released. And that's when you flip, as part of that flip release process, you then go and add the additional variable that's required, I guess, to expose that content publicly. But the thing about it, the thing I like about the CI/CD process is we have this thing where, so it is a bit of a technical challenge. I'm currently the one who's probably educating most people within the company about that. But we have enough people there that understand the principles and so forth, and actually are really excited by the way the technology works. So there are all these kind of moving parts. Antora is just the tool that builds the static website, but it depends also on the power of Git for managing that content, as well as continuous integration and building part of that. So the way we have things set up is we have our source repositories, and we have our main Antora documentation build repository, and within that we define a trigger within GitLab, and that gives you a particular token. So the trigger is something that where every time you send a signal, an API signal to that repository in GitLab, it automatically triggers a build of the documentation process. And that documentation build process can build to both the internal and external sites simultaneously. So, and all we do is within each of the documentation repositories, we add an extra a build job, which is that trigger itself. So whenever we commit to, say, a documentation branch, for example, in one of those documentation repositories, it automatically sends a trigger off and rebuilds the documentation sites. So people can be committing, documentation content, and then within a couple of minutes later, the site's rebuilt with their changes. So that's kind of how.
And how about on the challenges? I think I'd especially be interested. I mean, I know, well, I don't think you're an open source project, but I guess bringing in, because, one of the nice things with Markdown, it is very, very simple for people to kind of just make changes, even if they, whereas Asciidoctor to me sounds amazing for a lot of things, but it also introduces a lot of complexity. So I suppose bringing in non-developers, non-tech writers into the process, or things like that, if there's anything that's make it more challenging.
Yeah, so I think, I think it really depends on who's contributing to what content. So,
for sure.
So for tech writers, I think, with enough sort of coaching, I think for this kind of tech writing, you sort of have to be familiar with Git, or at least the fundamentals of it. Yeah. And then but you don't have to know everything that there is to know about Git, because I think it's something that tech writers can sort of learn on the job. And I mean, the sort of content that these kind of tech writers are writing for, they would have to have, I think, a reasonable amount of technical competency to sort of understand those principles. So I don't really see much of an issue there. It is just a matter of training people up. But once you have these kind of systems in place, it then becomes easier for them to see, what's been done and what content's generated. And I think that's kind of part of their learning process of how they become familiar with it. For example, I've got this release notes page that says, when you're talking about the latest public release, for example, but if you happen to be on an earlier version, it says version whatever, which is picked up as a version key as part of Asciidoctor. So I do a test that says if it's the latest, or if it's the latest release, show this bit of conditional text. If not, show that bit of conditional text. So we're able to say, this page shows the release notes for the latest version of this product, or this version shows the release notes for version product, for product name version such and such. So it's a different set of text, and you can sort of really get a lot of power in it, and you don't have to manage that content anymore. So you just have to branch it, and then that text, the text for the latest release then gets updated automatically for the next version. So it's just I think when you get people involved in looking at this kind of stuff, they'll eventually pick it up. So it's sometimes it looks like gobbledygook. You might have some kind of content that initially looks quite complex. But I think one of the other things that I'm sort of looking at is implementing comments, because Asciidoctor syntax is kind of like code, and you can put code comments in there. And that way, if you've got some complex looking, I guess, attributes or instructions that you put in that are Asciidoctor specific, that way you can at least let people know, what these things are for, and they don't go and delete them or do things like that. So, I think
yeah, I've done that a bit. I've put lots of comments in all my templates. And
I mean, I think it even helps you as a tech writer, because you sometimes forget there are so many. There's like 10 different ways of creating links in Asciidoctor. Possibly, I haven't counted it. But for example, Antora makes it very specific and prescriptive as to what type of linking syntax you should use. So and that provides you with that, because it fits in with their framework of how you should organize your content at the source level.
Was that ever frustrating? If it's very prescriptive, do you lose a bit of flexibility, or did that prescriptiveness just match what you wanted to do?
Well, I think part of the issue I had before working with Asciidoctor in a non-Antora system is, I think in this case it was built using Jekyll. It was with the Jenkins documentation. Is that it's not very prescriptive, and so you ended up with contributors using like so many different types of linking syntax, and you weren't quite sure which is the right one to use. Whereas what I like about Antora, it's very prescriptive. So that makes the job of creating links a lot easier, because there is one particular way of doing it. There are actually two that we use, because you're doing interpage links, so you use a kind of more of a simpler syntax for that. Sorry, within a page, links within a page to anchors, for example. But it makes it a lot easier because you don't have to think so much, and it fits in with the documentation framework and how you should model your documentation. So, and that in itself, people might think is a limitation, but I actually think it makes things a lot easier.
Oh, no, sure. Limitations are sometimes liberating.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. It stops you from writing bad well, it does what it can to prevent you from writing badly organized content.
So really, it sounds like Antora is a subset of Asciidoctor. It's a prescriptive subset of Asciidoctor based Asciidoctor that doesn't introduce anything new to the syntax, but sort of better defines within its constructs how you need to write Asciidoctor.
I think so. I mean, I'm pretty much going off by what's inside the Antora documentation. They build their own documentation in Antora, surprisingly.
Dog food, like a classic open source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
I have a follow-up question to that then.
Mm.
I was just going to say, like, I think in Asciidoctor, in Antora, you can probably use all the other markup syntax that's allowed by Asciidoctor, because that's what Asciidoctor supports and provides. But I just think it's sensible if you just use the ones that Antora recommends.
Mm.
Yeah.
So the controversial dog food in question is you're working for a CMS company. I have also done work, doing some consulting work with Umbraco, which is another CMS. And in the past, I actually know Squiz from a past life when I used to work a lot more with Drupal. I think Drupal is the only one of those that uses Drupal for its documentation. So why do you not?
Why do we not use Matrix?
I know the answer to the question. I'm being slightly facetious, but just go on. Did you try? Did you try at least?
I did. I think I think, like, I had a similar experience with Atlassian with Confluence as well. So, but yeah, it's Squiz Matrix is a CMS it serves a very different purpose. It's really designed to build static websites and give you a lot more complexity with rich formatting and so forth. And it's got a lot of elements that Antora has, but even more, but in a different, aimed at a different purpose. And I know our existing Matrix documentation is built in Matrix itself, and that's the stuff that we're looking to sort of migrate. But I've found that working with Antora just provides you with, so the velocity with which you can develop content is just much faster. It's something I'm familiar with, and even for example, to format code comments, it's much easier to do that in Antora, which supports that out of the box. Whereas that's kind of functionality that needs to be customized.
I kind of knew the answer to the question. I was just wondering if you'd ever tried.
Yeah. You can do it both, but I just get more velocity, I think, with that Antora, because it's designed for documentation. Yeah,
definitely.
Cool. All right.
Okay. You got some stuff to add, don't you? I think we might wrap up the conversation here.
Oh, very quickly. Actually, it was more relevant to you guys. You caught me on the hop there. I was frantically looking up something whilst because seeing as we actually have 3 Australians on this call, but only 2 who actually live there. I think the CFP for Write the Docs in Australia is still open, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Here it is. Yeah, June the 18th. Yeah, so I'm assuming that the Australian audience for this may be slightly higher than normal. So if you don't know already, 9th of August is the deadline for calls for proposals. I'm actually hoping to make it.
Okay, cool.
Because I might be at a conference in Japan a couple of weeks before, and you can always tell Australians when they're like, well, I'm nearly halfway, so I might as well keep going.
Exactly. In the hemisphere, why not just carry it forward?
So I might, but we'll see. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, that's right. So get down for that. It's if it's going to be anything near as good as the last conference, which I'm pretty sure it is, it's going to be an amazing meetup for the Australian folks. And it's great to have the folks from overseas come down and make the very, very long flight down to Australia as well, because we love to have them.
The only other thing I would quickly mention is, so I attended the little conference in Vilnius in Lithuania it's about a month ago now. I found that fascinating because obviously we tend to be operating the 3 of us anyway in the Anglosphere.
Yeah, for sure.
And because of where Lithuania is, the amount of people from Russia and Russian-speaking countries, and you just sort of naively forget that there's this whole other world out there writing documentation in their own languages and things. And it was quite interesting to meet so many of them who come from very different kinds of companies and things like that. So
that's really cool.
Interesting. Yeah.
Getting good perspectives about other countries' ways of writing. I think it's good. And I think this is a nice segue into joining in on the conversation like this with on the Write the Docs Slack channel, because you get folks in the Write the Docs Slack channel from everywhere in the world, all converging in one place that allows discussion about docs and different things. So you never know, you might actually find conversations like that coming up if the subject is ever broached. So you can come and join the Write the Docs Slack, and while you're there, how about you come and join the Write the Docs podcast channel, which is #podcast, and that's available at writethedocs.slack.com. So come and join there and join the conversation. You can also contact us via email if that's your thing. So it's writethedocspodcast@gmail.com. And of course, if you'd like to catch up on show notes and other bits of information, you can always go to the Write the Docs podcast website, which is podcast.writethedocs.org. There you see all the recent podcast episodes, and by visiting that site, you'll know that this episode is episode 22.
I cannot believe, Jared, it took 4 months. My God.
4 months.
Or nearly 4 months. What happened? I don't know. Okay.
We're now a quarterly podcast. There we go.
And we actually did 2 in March, which is quite amazing, and then took 3.5 months.
And then 3.5 months, nothing. Yeah, no, that's how it goes. It's not a regularly scheduled podcast. It's a podcast when we need to podcast, and definitely we needed to podcast today because it was great to listen to Giles and all of his information about Antora and just generally writing docs distributed across repositories. So look, Giles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Been great chatting. And if there's nothing else, I think we might wrap the show there. But before we wrap, we always have to say one thing, and that is docs, or it didn't happen. See you later, everyone.